What's up, and welcome back to Interpreting the Scares! That's right, we're continuing on our October marathon of spooky films with Scream. Scream, of course, is a highly popular series directed by Wes Craven that spanned 4 movies, possibly a 5th coming out soon, and 3 seasons of a TV show, all of which I've seen. One thing that you should probably know going into the film is that it's in the family of horror comedy, even though I'd say it leans pretty heavily onto the horror part. If you aren't well versed in horror tropes, you can still just enjoy the movie as a basic slasher film, but if you have that knowledge beforehand, you can end up really enjoying this movie and this series as a whole. So if you're abstaining from watching the film for whatever god-awful reason, maybe this review will change your mind. Let's get cracking. This review is brought to you by the word of the day: abstain, to refrain deliberately and often with an effort of self-denial from an action or practice. Scream focuses on Sidney Prescott, a young woman who begins getting stalked by a serial killer known only as Ghostface. Little is known about the killer other than the fact that he loves scary movies and is devout to following the rules you usually see in horror. Sidney would normally be seen as a stereotypical victim in a horror film, so can she survive this madman? I love a good horror comedy. The smarter the humor, the better the film is, in my opinion. Another film that comes to mind is The Cabin in the Woods, which was also a tongue-in-cheek horror film that leaned much more heavily to horror than comedy. But The Cabin in the Woods was not a franchise. This was because it was just so self-aware of being a scary movie that was essentially about being a scary movie. There's a lot you can do with something like that, and they embraced it tenfold with all of these different films. The first film is the most down-to-earth. I want to say the sequels leaned more and more into the obscure comedy part than the horror. Like, I feel like they made a lot of jokes about being a sequel in the second film, a lot of jokes about a trilogy in the third movie, and a lot of jokes about being a reboot in the fourth film. But we'll see if I'm remembering correctly soon enough. Makes me kind of curious as to what they would do with a fifth film, actually. Past the comedy itself, which I love, I'm old enough to remember that during the late 90s, early 2000s, that Ghostface mask and costume was all over the place on Halloween. Everybody had that costume, including myself. It was one of those things that was just instantly iconic. It is a little bit funny looking, but I think that's part of the charm, because the dude that's doing it is still horrific and absolutely terrifying. It's like people wearing political masks while robbing banks. The masks on their own are silly, but once somebody evil wears them, your view on the mask changes instantaneously and the mask becomes the character. And seeing Ghostface stalk his victims really is honestly unsettling and kind of a thing of nightmares. So again, even though this is partially comedy, it's so heavily leaning towards horror that comedy isn't even an official genre of the film. It is so smart what they did in this film, because it can appeal to a really wide audience for a variety of reasons. It appeals to people who love horror and can't get enough of it, and it appeals to people that hate horror because of all the ridiculous tropes associated with the genre. I can't not praise the writing that went into this film. I can't really think of many negatives associated with Scream. If anything, I would just say that it needed a smidge more comedy. The comedy that it does have is great, but it's a bit uneven and directly falls on the shoulders of Jamie Kennedy's character, who is basically a walking, talking horror movie encyclopedia. He's great in this movie, he really is, and whenever his character shines, the comedy blends really well with horror, like when he's watching a horror movie and he's like, "Behind you! Look behind you, you idiot!" The horror parts of this movie are happening directly behind him at the same exact time. It's genius. But most of that stuff isn't until the third act of the film. If memory serves correct, they expand more on his character in later sequels. So the comedy works a little bit better, but I couldn't tell you more about the overall story. We'll find that out soon. Looking at my end score, I really love the writing in this film, as it is pretty darn smart and introduced an instantly iconic horror villain into an already saturated genre. But some of the character importance, like with most slasher films, is basically nothing. There's a lot of useless characters in this film that don't really contribute to anything. That score is 76%, and because I had so much fun rewatching this movie, I gotta give the bias score a near perfect 96%. Averaging everything together, we come to the final rating of 86%, 86 out of 100 possible stars, or a B+ letter grade. And so far, technically the highest scored movie on my Interpreting the Scares event this year, but we have a long ways to go yet. Guys, what are your thoughts on this Scream movie? Are you a fan of it? Oh yeah, and what's your favorite scary movie? As for YouTube, you guys know what to do. Hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this review, because there's always more like it coming out each and every single day. Hit the subscribe button and bell to be notified when I come out with my review for Scream 2. And until then, guys, peace out!
Dave examines movies we just watch for fun. Davey is the expert. He is the #1 critic that I go to when I need a movie pick. Thanks for joining up with us.